My father left me $150 million and a poison I was supposed to drink slowly. The will arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a lawyer whose suit cost more than my annual salary, read in a conference room that smelled like the leather seats of the Porsche I'd returned at 25. I sat in a chair that was too big, at a table that was too long, and listened to a man describe my inheritance with the same tone my father had used to describe eviction notices. Efficient, indifferent, slightly amused. Winslow Vance. Real estate magnate, philanthropist. The man who built Charleston's skyline and buried its poor beneath the foundations. He died on his yacht, surrounded by men who were already dividing his assets before his body cooled. Heart attack, the coroner said. Natural causes. The same coroner who had signed my mother's death certificate 16 years earlier, ruling it suicide when it was murder. I knew that now. I didn't know it then, at 14, when they told me Eleanor had chosen to leave us, and I was sent to my room while funeral arrangements were made without my input. I didn't know it at 18, when I found the first eviction notice in my father's desk, not a business document, a personal letter from a woman with 3 children begging for 2 more weeks. I didn't know it at 25, when I confronted him and he looked at me with the expression he reserved for tenants who knelt on his office floor. Pity mixed with contempt, the look of a man who believes mercy is a weakness and weakness is a sin. You're my daughter, he'd said, you're a Vance. Vances don't weep for strangers. Vances build empires. I left that night. I left the Porsche, the apartment, the credit card with no limit. I took a job as a county social worker, living in a studio apartment the size of my father's walk-in closet, earning $30,000 a year, helping the same families he destroyed. For 7 years, I built a life separate from the Vance name. Not a good life. I was exhausted, in debt, isolated from everyone I'd grown up with, but a life with weight, with meaning, with the quiet certainty that every family I helped keep their home was a small revenge against the man who taught me that homes were commodities and people were liabilities. Then he died, and the will arrived. And I learned that my father had spent his final months, after the doctor gave him the diagnosis of a failing heart, crafting a trap so elegant, so personal, that only I could spring it. The money was unconditional. The control was not. The heiress shall maintain the operation of Vance Properties for a minimum of 5 years. The will read, under the terms and conditions established in the operations manual attached Appendix C. Failure to comply will result in the automatic transfer of all assets to the Winslow Vance Foundation for Urban Development, with no possibility of appeal. Appendix C was the eviction playbook, the intimidation tactics, the lists of problem tenants with notes like single mother, 3 children, 2 months behind, evict in winter and elderly with dementia, son in prison, easy to intimidate, the complete legacy, codified, ready to be continued. My father didn't leave me a fortune, he left me a test, a final exam, proof that blood calls to blood and a Vance always chooses money over conscience. I had 30 days to decide. I moved back into the mansion on the first day. Not because I wanted to, I hated that house, with its marble floors that echoed like empty churches and its windows that looked over the harbor where my father's yachts sat like trophies, but because the trap required proximity. You can't dismantle a machine from the outside. You have to be inside it, feeling its gears, learning its language, understanding which parts will break and which will bend. The staff greeted me with the same deference they'd shown my father. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who'd worked for the Vances for 30 years and never once met my eyes. The driver, Marcus, who'd chauffeured me to private school and knew every secret I'd whispered in the back seat. The security team, ex-military, ex-police men who'd broken down doors for my father and called it property recovery. I didn't fire them. That would have been satisfying and strategically useless. Instead, I watched. I listened. I learned who among them had hated my father, who had feared him, who had simply needed the paycheck and would do the same for anyone who signed it. Mrs. Chen, I discovered, had a daughter who'd been evicted by Vance Properties in 2019. She'd never told anyone, never filed a complaint, never even changed her expression when my father walked past. But when I mentioned, casually over breakfast, that I was reviewing past eviction cases, her hand shook as she poured my coffee. That was my first ally. My first thread, my first understanding that my father's empire wasn't built on loyalty. It was built on fear, and fear could be transformed into something else if you gave people permission to feel it. I assumed control of Vance Properties on day 7. The board of directors, 5 men, All white, all over 60, all appointed by my father during decades of reciprocal favors, expected a figurehead. A daughter who would sign where they pointed, attend the charity galas, smile for the cameras while they continued the business of extracting rent from the desperate. I fired 3 of them in the first meeting. Not the ones I hated most, that would have been too obvious, too emotional, too easy to dismiss as a grieving daughter's tantrum. I fired the ones whose records showed the most legal exposure, the ones who'd signed off on evictions that violated state law, the ones who'd accepted bribes from contractors to ignore code violations, the ones who, if investigated, would sing like birds to save themselves. This isn't personal, I told the remaining 2 over coffee in my father's, now my, office. It's risk management. Their methods generated liabilities. I'm protecting the company's interests. They believed me, or they pretended to believe me, which was the same thing. Because I was speaking their language. The language of profit, of protection, of power maintained through pragmatism rather than principle. I replaced the fired directors with lawyers. Not corporate lawyers, housing rights attorneys, civil rights advocates, people who'd spent their careers suing companies like mine. I called them compliance consultants, paid them exorbitant fees, and let the remaining board members assume they were window dressing. They weren't. They were architects. The first year, I changed the lease agreements, eliminated the clauses that allowed rent increases without notice, removed the provisions that made tenants liable for property damage that was actually normal wear, added a 30-day grace period for late payments with mandatory mediation before eviction proceedings could begin. The board protested. I overruled them. We're losing revenue, they said. We're gaining stability, I replied. A tenant who stays 5 years is more profitable than 5 tenants who stay 1 year each. The math is simple. The math was simple. It was also a lie. The new policies cost money, real money, millions in foregone revenue, in legal fees, in maintenance that should have been done years ago. But the lie bought me time. It bought me credibility. It bought me the appearance of a competent heiress who understood business better than her father. What I was actually doing was building a paper trail. Every lease I changed created a document. Every eviction I prevented created a record. Every conversation I had with a tenant, recorded, transcribed, filed, added to the archive I was constructing in a storage unit across town, under a name that wasn't mine. By the end of year 2, I had 10,000 pages. By year 3, 20,000. By year 4, I was running out of storage space. And then I found the letters. They were in a drawer my father had believed was secret. A false bottom in his desk, the kind of cliché that exists because people who think they're clever repeat the same patterns. The drawer was locked, but the key was in the same box where he kept his cufflinks. I'd found that key at 12, playing spy in my father's office, and I'd never told anyone. The letters were from my mother, not love letters. Warnings. Written in the 6 months before her death, addressed to an attorney named Patricia Okonkwo who, according to the postmarks, never received them. I researched Okonkwo. Found her alive, practicing in Atlanta, specializing in housing discrimination cases. Called her, flew to meet her, showed her the letters. She went pale. Your mother contacted me in 2010. She said she had evidence of serious crimes. We scheduled a meeting. The day before my car was run off the road, I was hospitalized for 3 weeks. When I got out, I tried to reach her. I was told she died. Suicide. She paused. I didn't believe it, but I was afraid. I had children. I let it go. Don't let it go now, I said. She didn't. The letters documented everything, the bribes to housing inspectors, the illegal evictions, the utilities cut off in winter to motivate payment. The fire was the worst. In 2008, my father had owned a building in North Charleston. 12 units, mostly families, mostly black, mostly one missed paycheck away from disaster. The city wanted the land for a development project. My father wanted the insurance money. The building burned on a Tuesday night in November. Everyone got out miraculously, the fire department said, but 3 people were hospitalized for smoke inhalation, and the building was condemned. The fire was ruled accidental. Faulty wiring, the inspector said. The inspector who'd received a consulting fee from Vance Properties the week before. My mother's letter described it differently. She'd overheard my father on the phone, ordering the fire. Not to kill anyone, Winslow wasn't a murderer, she wrote, he was worse. He was a man who calculated acceptable losses, who weighed human lives against profit margins and found the equation balanced, who set a fire knowing people were inside, trusting that they'd wake up, trusting that the fire department would arrive, trusting that the miracle of survival would cover the sin of the act itself. He told me, my mother wrote in her final letter, dated 3 weeks before her death, that I was being dramatic, that no one had died, that the insurance settlement would fund a new community center which would help more people than 12 apartments ever could. He told me that I didn't understand business, that I was weak. That weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford in a wife. I told him that I understood business perfectly, that I understood he was a monster, and that I was taking our daughter and leaving. He smiled, that smile he has, the one that means he's already won. Eleanor, he said, you're not taking anything, you're a Vance now, and Vances don't leave. She left anyway, or tried to. The letters stopped. 3 weeks later she was dead. I didn't confront the board with the letters. I didn't go to the police, the same police who'd ruled my mother's death a suicide, who'd ruled the fire accidental, who'd received donations from the Winslow Vance Foundation for their annual charity ball. Instead, I kept building. The letters joined the archive grew, and in year 4 I found the final piece. A DNA test, not recent, from 1995 when I was 2 years old. My father had ordered it secretly through a private lab, using samples taken from my hairbrush and his own blood. The result, 0% probability of paternity. Winslow Vance was not my biological father. I stared at the paper for an hour. Then I researched the lab, the doctor who'd signed the report, the chain of custody, and I found my mother's affair. Marcus Cole, professor of African American history at the College of Charleston, a man who'd taught there for 15 years, published 3 books, spoken at community events. A man who'd been fired in 1996, budget cuts, the college said, and who'd left Charleston shortly after, moving to Baltimore, changing his name, disappearing into the kind of obscurity that doesn't happen by accident. My father had done to Marcus what he'd done to tenants who organized, to lawyers who asked questions, to anyone who threatened the Vance empire. He'd made him invisible. Not through violence. Winslow didn't use violence directly, he used systems. He'd had Marcus's tenure review manipulated, his publications criticized, his reputation destroyed. He'd bought the building where Marcus lived and renovated it, tripling the rent. He'd made phone calls to other universities, ensuring that no one would hire a troublemaker. And he'd kept me. Not out of love, the DNA test proved he knew. He'd kept me because proving he could raise his enemy's daughter as a Vance was the sweetest victory. Because every time I smiled at a charity gala, every time I signed a check with his name, every time I straightened my hair to hide the curl he found unprofessional, he won. My mother had known. The letters mentioned it, obliquely, carefully, aware that they might be intercepted. He knows about Marcus, she wrote. He says it doesn't matter, that you're his daughter in every way that counts, but I see the way he looks at you, Celeste. I see the calculation. The scorekeeping. He's not raising a child, he's winning a game. She tried to save me, tried to get me out, and she died for it. I spent the 5th year preparing. Not for revenge, revenge is a fire that consumes the arsonist. I prepared for transformation. For the systematic dismantling of everything my father had built, using the tools he'd given me. I hired more lawyers. Not secretly anymore, openly, as compliance consultants, as diversity advisors, as community liaisons. I created departments within Vance properties that had never existed. Tenant advocacy, historical preservation, environmental impact. I filled them with people who hated everything the company stood for, who'd spent their careers fighting companies like mine, who looked at me with suspicion I had to earn away day by day. I changed the company's bylaws. Required board approval for any eviction, not just the executive's approval, but the full board, including my new directors. Added mandatory mediation. Added legal review. Added timelines that made the quick, brutal evictions my father had perfected impossible. The remaining board members, the 2 I'd kept, the ones who'd survived the first purge, protested. Threatened to call a shareholder meeting to remove me as CEO to invoke the will's clauses about failure to maintain operations. I showed them the letters. Not all of them, just enough. The fire, the bribes, the inspector who'd ruled my mother's death a suicide while receiving consulting fees from Vance Properties. You can try to remove me, I said, you can invoke the will. But if you do, all of this becomes public. Not just my father's crimes, your complicity, your signatures on documents you knew were fraudulent, your silence while people burned. They didn't call the meeting. The 5-year mark arrived on a Thursday. I spent the morning in my office, my father's office. Now mine, though I'd changed everything. The furniture, the art, the view from the window that now looked toward the city instead of the harbor. I spent the afternoon in meetings, the same meetings I'd had for 5 years, the same performances of competence and control. At 5 p.m. I called the press conference. It wasn't in the mansion. It wasn't in a hotel ballroom. It was in a community center, one my father had funded as a tax write-off, one that served the neighborhood he'd tried to gentrify, one filled with people who'd received eviction notices with his signature. I stood at a podium that wobbled slightly, in front of a microphone that squealed when I tapped it. The room was full, not of journalists from the society pages, but of community organizers, tenant advocates, people who'd spent decades fighting my family and had learned not to trust anyone with the Vance name. "My name is Celeste Vance," I said, "and I am here to dissolve Vance Properties." The room went silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of people who have been disappointed too many times to react immediately. Effective immediately, all assets of Vance Properties are transferred to the Aliner Community Land Trust, controlled by a board of tenant representatives, housing advocates, and community organizers. All rental properties become permanently affordable housing, with rents capped at 30% of median income. All commercial properties are converted to community-owned cooperatives. The liquid assets, approximately $150 million, will be distributed as follows: $50 million to a victim compensation fund for families harmed by Vance Properties' past actions, $50 million to legal defense funds for tenants facing eviction nationwide, and $50 million to the establishment of the Aliner Cole Center for Housing Justice, named for my mother who tried to stop my father and was silenced. I paused, looked at the faces in the crowd. Some were crying. Some were angry at me, at my name, at the audacity of a Vance claiming to fix what Vances had broken. Some were simply watching, waiting for the catch, the loophole, the hidden clause that would make this another performance of charity masking extraction. "There is no catch," I said. "There are no conditions. The transfer is irrevocable. The trust is controlled by the community, not by me. I am resigning as CEO effective immediately. I am renouncing any claim to the Vance name. And I am releasing all documents in my possession, approximately 40,000 pages, documenting crimes committed by Vance Properties, its executives, and its collaborators, including law enforcement officials, judges, and inspectors who accepted bribes or favors in exchange for silence." I held up a hard drive. "This contains everything: eviction records, financial transfers, the letters my mother wrote before she was murdered, the DNA test that proves I am not Winslow Vance's biological daughter, and the names of every person who helped him, who protected him, who profited from his crimes. I am not a hero. I am not a savior. I am a woman who spent 5 years inside a machine, learning how it worked, so I could break it from within. I did not do this alone. I had lawyers who risked their careers, employees who risked their jobs, tenants who risked their homes to trust someone they had every reason to hate. But I did this because my mother died trying. Because a man named Marcus Cole was driven from his home, his career, his city, for the crime of loving her. Because Winslow Vance spent his life proving that money could buy silence, and I am here to prove that silence has a price he never calculated. Thank you." I stepped away from the podium. The room exploded, not with applause, but with voices, questions, arguments, the chaotic sound of a community that had been told what to think for decades suddenly being asked to decide for itself. I walked out the back door, into an alley that smelled like garbage and hope. And I breathed, for the first time in 5 years, air that didn't carry the weight of my father's name. The aftermath was not clean. It was not simple. It was not the ending of a movie where the villain falls and the hero rises and everyone lives happily ever after. 3 board members, the ones I'd fired in year 1, were indicted. 2 were convicted. 1 died before trial, natural causes, the same convenient ending that had protected my father. The police commissioner resigned. The coroner who'd ruled my mother's death a suicide was disbarred. 3 judges faced disciplinary hearings. 2 were removed from the bench. The 3rd is still serving, quieter now, less visible, always looking over his shoulder. Harrow Development, the company that had partnered with my father on the gentrification projects, declared bankruptcy 6 months after the documents were released. Their CEO, a man named Bradford who'd played golf with my father every Sunday, was investigated but never charged. He moved to Florida, bought a condo, and was photographed at a Trump rally 2 years later, smiling like nothing had happened. The Vance name became synonymous with corruption in Charleston. The mansion was sold to a hotel chain, converted into a boutique resort where guests could experience Southern elegance. I never went back. I couldn't bear to see strangers swimming in the pool where I'd learned to float, dining in the room where I'd eaten breakfast alone every morning, sleeping in the wing where my mother had died. And my father, Winslow Vance, was dead. Beyond justice, beyond punishment, beyond the reach of the laws he'd spent his life circumventing. But not beyond memory. Not beyond the 40,000 pages that documented his crimes. Not beyond the community center that now bore my mother's name, where children learned to read and families learned their rights, and no one was ever evicted in winter. I found Marcus Cole in Baltimore, 6 months after the dissolution. Not because I was looking for him, I told myself I wasn't, told myself I was focused on rebuilding, on healing, on becoming someone who didn't carry the Vance name like a scar. But I was in the city for a conference, and I saw his name on a flyer. Dr. Marcus Cole, Professor Emeritus, lecture on housing discrimination in the American South, and I couldn't not go. He was 7'2", thin, with gray hair cropped close and eyes that held the weariness of someone who'd fought battles he knew he couldn't win. He spoke about redlining, about restrictive covenants, about the systematic destruction of Black wealth through housing policy. He spoke with the precision of a historian and the anger of someone who'd lived it. After the lecture, I waited until the room emptied. Then I approached him, holding the only photograph I had of my mother, the one I'd saved, hidden in the lining of a suitcase, the one that showed her young and smiling and alive. "Dr. Cole," I said, "my name is Celeste, and I think you knew my mother." He looked at the photograph, then at me. And something in his face, the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, the way he held his head slightly tilted, as if listening to a frequency most people couldn't hear, made me understand. Finally, why I'd never looked like the Vance women. Why my hair curled when theirs fell straight. Why my skin darkened in summer while theirs stayed pale as porcelain. "Eleanor," he whispered, "not a question, a prayer. She tried to leave him," I said, "for you, for us. She wrote letters, she made plans, and he stopped her." Marcus closed his eyes. When he opened them they were wet, but his voice was steady. I knew then when she stopped writing. When her phone was disconnected. When I read about her suicide in the newspaper and I knew that Winslow had done something. But I was afraid. I had a new job, a new life, a family that depended on me. I told myself that if I fought he'd destroy me too, and he would have. He did anyway, just more slowly. "You couldn't have saved her," I said. "I couldn't have saved her. She was alone and she was brave and she died because of it. But she didn't fail. She left proof. She left letters. She left me." I told him everything. The 5 years, the archive, the dissolution, the community center. He listened without interrupting, his hands clasped on the table between us, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he reached across the table, took my hand. His fingers were dry and warm and slightly trembling. "You have her eyes," he said, "not the color, the look. The way she had of seeing through people, through lies, through the performance to the person underneath. She looked at me like that the first time we met. I was lecturing on Reconstruction. She was in the front row. And when I finished, she stood up and said, 'You're wrong about the role of Black women in the land redistribution movements. They weren't passive recipients. They were organizers, they were strategists, and you're erasing them.'" He laughed, a real laugh, surprised, remembering. I fell in love with her in that moment, not because she was right, though she was, but because she wasn't afraid to tell a man in a position of power that he was wrong, that he was leaving people out, that his story was incomplete. "She would have been proud of you," he said, "not because of what you did to Winslow's empire, because of what you did for the people he hurt, because you finished the story she started." I cried then. Not the controlled tears of a Vance, not the strategic displays of emotion I'd learned to perform at charity events. Real tears, ugly tears, the tears of a daughter who'd spent 32 years believing she was alone and was suddenly, impossibly, not. Marcus held my hand until I stopped. Then he said, "I have something for you." He reached into his bag, a worn leather satchel, professorial, unpretentious, and pulled out a book. A hardcover, academic press, his name on the spine. "The Architecture of Exclusion, Race, Space, and Resistance in the American City. I wrote this in 2005, he said, before I left Charleston, before I knew about you, about what Winslow was doing, about how far it would go. But I dedicated it to someone." He opened to the dedication page. I read, "For E, who taught me that the strongest walls are built by those who believe they own the ground beneath them." and that the ground remembers, even when the walls forget. I thought she was dead, Marcus said. I thought the dedication was a memorial, a gesture to someone who couldn't read it, and now I find that she left a daughter, that the ground did remember, that the walls are finally starting to crack. I took the book, held it to my chest, and for the first time in my life I felt like I was holding something that belonged to me, not inherited, not stolen, not earned through performance or sacrifice. Just mine. A connection to a woman I'd never known, through a man I was just beginning to know, in a story that was still being written. I live in Baltimore now. Not with Marcus. We need space, we need time, we need to learn how to be family without the pressure of making up for decades in a single conversation. But near him, in the same neighborhood, I see him for coffee on Sundays, for dinner on birthdays, for long walks where he tells me about my mother's laugh, her temper, her terrible cooking, the way she danced when she thought no one was watching. I work as a financial counselor for nonprofits. I help families navigate systems I know from the inside: mortgage applications, rental agreements, tax credits, the labyrinth of paperwork designed to discourage the people who need help most. I don't make much money. I don't have much status. I am not a Vance anymore in name or in fact. But I have something better. I have mornings where I wake up and don't remember my father's voice before I remember my own. I have clients who trust me because I understand, not because I condescend. I have a community that knows my real name, Celeste Cole, the name my mother wanted me to have, the name I legally adopted 2 years after the dissolution, and uses it with affection rather than fear. And I have the Alina Cole Center. I visit every month. Though I don't run it, I made sure of that, built governance structures that prevent any single person from controlling it, including me. I sit in the back of the community room, watching children learn to read, watching tenants learn their rights, watching the same people my father evicted become the same people who now decide who stays and who goes. Once a year, on the anniversary of my mother's death, I light a candle in the window of my apartment. Not for Winslow, for Alina, for the woman who tried to speak and was silenced, who tried to protect her daughter and was betrayed, who died believing she had failed. She didn't fail. The letters existed even if intercepted. The truth survived even if buried. And a daughter can inherit poison and choose not to drink it. I am the daughter of 2 parents, the heir of 2 legacies, and every day I choose which one to continue. I'm Celeste. I'm 32 years old. I was raised in a mansion built on eviction notices, educated in schools funded by predatory rents, trained to believe that wealth was virtue and poverty was failure. I spent 7 years running from my name, and 5 years using it to destroy what it represented. I am not a hero. I am not a victim. I am a woman who learned that the strongest walls are built by those who believe they own the ground beneath them, and that the ground remembers, even when the walls forget. If someone ever told you that your blood determines your worth, or if you're still trying to choose which inheritance to keep and which to burn, drop a fire below. I read every single comment. And if this story made you want to find your real name, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. What are you finally ready to dissolve? Backhand index pointing down.